Sometimes the hardest thing in life is finding peace after loss. Clara Dawson thought she'd finally found it in the quiet mountains of Cold Creek, helping a reclusive man named Jacob Holt tend his cabin. Then a wealthy ranch owner named Silas Trent rode up, demanding money Clara didn't owe and treating her like she was nothing. He grabbed her arm. Jacob warned him to stop. Silas laughed in his face. What happened next took only seconds. The mountain man moved, and suddenly Silas was on the ground begging for mercy. How did one moment change everything for an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in the Montana Territory carried the scent of pine and coming snow. Clara Dawson stood on the porch of Jacob Holt's cabin, watching the sun break over the peaks to the east. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and breathed in deep. 8 months had passed since Thomas died, and this was the first morning she'd woken without that crushing weight on her chest. Strange how grief worked. Some days it felt like drowning. Other days, like today, it felt like learning to breathe again. She touched the simple gold band on her left hand, Thomas's ring, the one he'd placed there 17 years ago in a Philadelphia church. She hadn't taken it off, even after the accident, even after the funeral, even after the long winter when she'd seriously considered following him into the ground. But spring had come, and with it, an unexpected friendship that had saved her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The cabin door creaked open behind her. Jacob stepped out, 2 tin cups in his hands, steam rising from the coffee. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with grey threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years and harder memories. He moved quietly, the way men do who've spent more time with mountains than people. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her a cup. "Thank you." Clara wrapped both hands around the warmth. "I was just thinking how different everything feels now." Jacob leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the mountains he'd called home for 15 years. "Different good or different complicated?" She smiled. "Both, I suppose. They'd developed this rhythm over the past few months, comfortable silences punctuated by honest words. It was nothing like her marriage to Thomas, which had been full of constant conversation and social obligations. Thomas had been a good man, a kind husband, but he'd lived in a world of business deals and town council meetings. Jacob lived in a world of seasons and survival. And somehow Clara had found more peace in his silence than she'd ever found in Thomas's words. It had started last December, during the worst storm anyone in Cold Creek could remember. Clara had been living in her small house in town, running through her savings, trying to figure out what to do with a lumber business she didn't understand and debts she couldn't pay. Mrs. Yates at the trading post had mentioned the mountain man who came down once a month for supplies. "Always paid in cash, never stayed to talk. Someone should check on him," Mrs. Yates had said. "This storm's been going 3 days. His cabin's 5 miles up the ridge." Clara had volunteered, surprising herself. Maybe she'd needed the distraction. Maybe she'd needed to help someone else to remember she was still alive. She'd loaded a mule with supplies: coffee, flour, salted meat, lamp oil, and made the climb through snow that was already waist-deep in places. She'd found Jacob half frozen, his woodpile buried, his door frozen shut. He'd been burning furniture to stay warm. The look on his face when she'd knocked, surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been relief, stayed with her still. They hadn't talked much that first day. She'd helped him dig out the woodpile, got his stove working properly, made a pot of stew from the supplies she'd brought. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, he'd walked her back to town without a word. But at her door, he turned and said, "I'm obliged to you, Mrs. Dawson." A week later, he'd appeared at her house with 2 rabbits, already cleaned and dressed. "A payment for the supplies," he'd said. She'd invited him in for coffee. They'd talked for an hour, or rather, she'd talked and he'd listened, which was what she'd needed. He'd come back the next week with firewood. Then the week after, with a repaired window frame she'd mentioned was broken. By February, she was riding up to his cabin every few days. By March, she was staying overnight when the weather was bad, sleeping in his spare room, the one that had been his daughter's, though she hadn't known that yet. By April, they were working side by side to repair his winter-damaged roof, and she was laughing for the first time since Thomas died. Now it was late October again, the wheel turning full circle, and Clara couldn't imagine her life without this quiet, damaged man who'd somehow become her anchor. "We should head into town today," Jacob said, breaking into her thoughts. "You need supplies, and I could use some tobacco." Clara nodded. "Mrs. Yates mentioned she got a new shipment of fabric. I was thinking about making curtains for the—" She stopped herself, suddenly self-conscious. "For the cabin?" Jacob finished, a slight smile at the corner of his mouth. "Clara, you've been making this place a home for months now. No need to be shy about it. I don't want to presume—" "You're not presuming anything. I like the curtains. I like having real food instead of rabbit and beans. I like—" He paused, took a drink of coffee. "I like not being alone anymore." The honesty in his voice made Clara's chest tighten. She reached out and squeezed his arm, just for a moment, then stepped back. They hadn't crossed certain lines, hadn't spoken certain words, but the understanding between them was clear. This meant something. They meant something. "Then I'll make curtains," she said softly. "Yellow ones, I think, to brighten up the winter." "Yellow sounds good." They finished their coffee as the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Down in the valley, Cold Creek would be waking up. Doc Brennan opening his office, Pastor Wells ringing the church bell, Sheriff Markham making his lazy rounds. It was a small town, barely 300 people clinging to the edge of civilization. Most folks were decent, hard-working, trying to build something in this harsh country. But not everyone. Clara thought of Silas Trent, the man who owned the largest ranch in 3 counties. She'd only met him once at Thomas's funeral. He'd offered his condolences with a smile that never reached his eyes, then mentioned that Thomas had owed him money. She'd been too grief-stricken to process it then, had mumbled something about looking into it later. She'd found no record of any debt in Thomas's papers. Thomas had been meticulous about his accounts, had run his lumber business with careful precision. If he'd owed money, especially to someone like Trent, there would have been documentation. She'd put it out of her mind, assuming Trent had been mistaken. But Mrs. Yates had mentioned seeing Trent in town last week, asking questions about Clara, about where she was spending her time, about the mountain man she'd been seen with. A small worry nagged at the back of Clara's mind, but she pushed it away. Trent was a powerful man with business interests all over the territory. He had better things to do than concern himself with a widow's life. She touched the locket around her neck. She'd put it on immediately, the silver cool against her skin. A promise from a damaged man that he wouldn't fail again. Clara made her own silent promise to the darkness. She wouldn't let Trent win, not because of pride or stubbornness, but because men like him needed to learn that some people couldn't be bought, frightened, or destroyed, even if it cost her everything, especially if it cost her everything. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming early this year. Clara wondered if she'd live to see spring. Then she pushed the thought away. Fear was what Trent wanted. Fear was how he controlled people. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Tomorrow she'd start fighting back. Tomorrow she'd find out who in Cold Creek still had courage left. Tomorrow the real battle would begin. 3 days passed like winter wind, cold, relentless, unforgiving. Trent's pressure came not in violence, but in something worse, isolation. Clara's belongings appeared in crates outside the trading post, removed from her house in town by Sheriff Markham under some legal pretense about unpaid debts. When she tried to enter her own home, she found the locks changed and a notice of seizure posted on the door. Mrs. Yates stored the crates in her back room, whispering apologies. "I'm sorry, honey, but I can't be seen helping you too much. Trent's already threatened to cut off my credit line with his suppliers." In church that Sunday, Pastor Wells delivered a sermon about the dangers of impropriety and how good Christian women should guard their reputations. He wouldn't meet Clara's eyes when he said it, but the message was clear. Half the congregation stared at her. The other half looked away. After the service, Clara approached several women she'd considered friends. They made excuses, gathered their children, and hurried away. Only Doc Brennan stopped to speak with her, and even he glanced nervously at the watching crowd. "This town is afraid," he said quietly. "Trent's been making it known that anyone who helps you will suffer consequences." "What kind of consequences?" The banker suddenly remembered a missed payment on the Hendersons' farm loan. They have 2 weeks to come up with $500 or lose everything. The blacksmith supplier in Helena refused his last order without explanation. Mary Gunderson's son was released from his job at Trent's ranch with no cause given. Doc Brennan shook his head. "He's tightening the noose, Clara, making examples. So everyone just gives up. Everyone survives." Doc Brennan's voice was sad but firm. "I'm sorry. I truly am." Clara rode back to the cabin alone, Jacob having stayed behind to hunt. The isolation felt physical, a weight pressing on her chest. This was Trent's real weapon, not violence but the slow suffocation of being cut off from community, from support, from hope. She found Jacob on the porch when she returned, cleaning his rifle. One look at her face told him everything. "Bad?" he asked. "Worse." She dismounted, led Rosie to the small corral. "He's making me invisible, convincing everyone that helping me means losing everything they have." Jacob set down the rifle. "Come here." She went to him and he wrapped his arms around her. For a moment Clara let herself be held, let herself feel the safety of his strength. Then she stepped back, wiped her eyes. "I won't cry. He doesn't deserve my tears. He doesn't deserve anything," Jacob agreed. "But you're allowed to feel this." Clara noticed something then, a troubled look on Jacob's face that went beyond concern for her. "What is it? What happened while I was gone?" Jacob hesitated, then said, "Had a visitor. Old trapper named Jedediah comes through sometimes. He had news from Helena." "What kind of news?" "Said there was talk in the saloons about Silas Trent, about his business partner from 15 years back, a mine owner named Marcus Wolfe." Clara went still. The man who killed my family." "Yes." Jacob's jaw was tight. "Jedediah didn't know I had any connection. He was just passing along gossip. Said Wolfe and Trent were partners in some kind of land scheme, forcing homesteaders off valuable property. They made a fortune until Wolfe disappeared and the operation shut down." "Disappeared," Clara repeated. "You mean when you—" "Yes," Clara's mind raced. "So Trent knows who you are. He's known all along." "More than that." Jacob met her eyes. "I think that's why he's here. Why he targeted you. Jedediah said Trent moved to Cold Creek 5 years ago, started buying up land, building his empire. He's been doing what he and Wolfe did in Helena, just more carefully this time. But why wait until now to come after you?" "Because I stayed hidden, kept to myself, didn't give him any openings." Jacob's voice was heavy with guilt. Until I let someone matter to me again." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. "Thomas," Clara whispered. "Jacob, what if Thomas discovered the connection? What if he found out about Wolfe and Trent's past, and that's why—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. "Doc Brennan examined Thomas's body," Jacob said quietly. "After you mentioned that bruise on his temple, I asked him about it. He said he'd had doubts at the time, but convinced himself it was from the accident." "It wasn't an accident." Clara's voice shook with rage. "Trent killed my husband. We don't have proof." "I know it's true. In my bones, I know it." Clara paced the porch, fury giving her energy. "Thomas was cautious, careful. He wouldn't have been standing where those logs could hit him unless someone positioned him there. Or hit him first and made it look like an accident." Jacob was silent, and Clara knew he was thinking the same thing. "This isn't about money," she said. "It never was. The debt, the harassment, it's all to draw you out, to make you react. He wants revenge for Wolfe," Jacob said, "and he's using you to get it." Clara stopped pacing, looked at the man who'd become her anchor in the storm. "We can't let him. We can't let Thomas's death be for nothing. Then what do we do?" Clara thought about the isolation, the fear, the way Trent had turned an entire town against them through intimidation and economic pressure. Traditional justice was impossible. He owned the sheriff, influenced the judge, controlled too many levers of power. But there had to be another way. Or we expose him, Clara said. Not just to Cold Creek, but to the territorial government. We prove he killed Thomas, prove his connection to Wolf, prove he's been running the same criminal operation for years. How? Doc Brennan can send telegrams. He has connections in Helena, other doctors, government officials. If we can get Thomas's ledger to the right people, along with testimony about the suspicious circumstances of his death. Trent's men watch the telegraph office. Jacob interrupted. And Doc Brennan's already under pressure. If he's caught helping us, Trent will destroy him too. Clara knew he was right, but desperation was making her bold. Then we find someone Trent doesn't control, someone who isn't afraid of him. Who? Before Clara could answer, they heard a horse approaching. Both tensed, but it was Pastor Wells riding alone and looking deeply uncomfortable. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing, as if afraid to come closer. Mrs. Dawson, Mr. Holt, may I speak with you? Clara crossed her arms. Come to deliver another sermon about my reputation? The pastor flinched. I deserve that. I was a coward in church and I'm ashamed of it. He took a breath. But I'm here now because my conscience won't let me stay silent anymore. What do you want? Jacob asked, his tone skeptical. To help, and to give you something. Pastor Wells reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. 3 weeks before he died, Thomas came to see me. He was troubled, said he'd discovered something about Silas Trent that frightened him. He gave me this letter and asked me to mail it to the territorial marshal if anything happened to him. Clara's heart began to pound. I was afraid, the pastor continued, his voice breaking. When Thomas died, I told myself it was just an accident, that mailing this letter would only cause trouble. I kept it hidden, telling myself I was waiting for the right time. He held out the envelope. There's never going to be a right time. I should have sent this months ago. I'm sorry. Clara took the letter with trembling hands. The envelope was addressed to Territorial Marshal William Hayes in Helena, and it was sealed with Thomas's personal seal. Thank you, she whispered. There's more. Pastor Wells glanced nervously at the trail behind him. Trent came to see me yesterday, offered me money to convince you to leave town, to publicly denounce your relationship with Mr. Holt. When I hesitated, he threatened to reveal certain financial difficulties the church has been having. What did you tell him? I told him I'd think about it. The pastor met her eyes. But I'm done being afraid. Whatever happens, I'll testify about this letter, about Thomas's state of mind before he died, about Trent's attempts to bribe me. It's not much, but it's what I can offer. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. It's everything. After Pastor Wells left, Clara and Jacob sat at the cabin's small table and carefully opened Thomas's letter. The handwriting was familiar, achingly so, and Clara had to blink back tears to read the words. Thomas had documented everything. Trent's partnership with Marcus Wolf, the suspicious deaths and accidents near properties they wanted, the pattern of fraud and intimidation. He'd gathered names, dates, and had even found a witness, a former ranch hand of Trent's who'd been present when Wolf disappeared and was willing to testify about what really happened. The letter ended with words that broke Clara's heart. If you're reading this, I'm likely dead. Protect my wife, Clara. She knows nothing of this, but Trent may target her to silence any questions about my death. She deserves better than to suffer for my investigation. Please see that she gets justice. Clara pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing. Jacob held her while she cried for the man who'd tried to protect her, even from beyond the grave. When the tears finally stopped, Clara felt something shift inside her. The grief was still there, but underneath it was something harder, stronger. We mail this letter, she said firmly, and we make Trent answer for everything he's done. But mailing the letter proved more complicated than they'd hoped. The telegraph office was in the general store, operated by Harold Sims, who'd been notably absent from church and hadn't spoken to Clara since Trent's threats began. Jacob suggested they ride to the next town, 15 miles south, but Clara knew Trent would have men watching the roads. They needed someone Trent wouldn't suspect. Someone who could move freely. The answer came from an unexpected source. Doc Brennan arrived at the cabin the next morning, his medical bag in hand and an urgency in his manner. "I'm here under the pretense of checking on you after your ordeal," he said, loud enough to carry. Then quieter, "But really, I have information." Inside the cabin, he laid it out. "I've been asking quiet questions, talking to people Trent's hurt over the years. There are more than you'd think. A widow whose son died in a hunting accident after refusing to sell his land. A shopkeeper who went bankrupt after crossing Trent. A rancher's daughter who disappeared after rejecting Trent's advances. They'll testify?" Clara asked hopefully. "They're afraid." "But—" Doc Brennan pulled out a small notebook. "I've written down their stories, their names, dates. It's not legal testimony, but it's a start. It shows a pattern." Jacob examined the notebook. "This is good work, Doc, but we still need to get it, along with Thomas's letter, to the territorial marshal." "I have an idea about that," Doc Brennan said. "There's a traveling judge who comes through every few months, Judge Calloway. He's due in Cold Creek in 5 days. He's not perfect, and Trent has influence over him, but Calloway's not completely corrupt. If we can present everything to him publicly, in front of witnesses, he'll have to act, or he'll side with Trent," Jacob said skeptically. "Possibly, but it's our best chance." Doc Brennan looked between them. "We need to buy time. Make Trent think you're cooperating. Keep him confident until the judge arrives." Clara understood what he was suggesting, but the idea made her stomach turn. "You want me to meet with Trent, pretend to consider his proposal? It would give us the time we need, and keep him from escalating the violence." Jacob was already shaking his head. "No, I won't let Clara anywhere near that man." "I can do it," Clara said quietly. "Jacob, if it means getting justice for Thomas, I can do it." They argued for an hour, but Clara was adamant. Finally, Jacob agreed, on the condition that he'd be nearby, watching, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Doc Brennan left with a plan. He'd send word to Trent that Clara wanted to discuss terms. They'd arrange a meeting at Trent's ranch in 3 days, which would give them time to prepare and would coincide with Judge Calloway's arrival in Cold Creek. The next 2 days were tense. Jacob taught Clara how to handle the small pistol he'd given her, making her practice until she could load and fire it without thinking. They discussed signals. If she touched her left ear, it meant she was in danger. If she stood and walked toward the door, he should prepare to act. "I won't let him hurt you," Jacob said on the eve of the meeting. They were sitting on the cabin porch, watching the stars emerge. "I failed Sarah and Emma, I won't fail you." Clara took his scarred hand in hers. "You didn't fail them. A cruel man made a choice and they paid the price. That wasn't your fault." "Feels like it was." "I know." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "But you get to choose differently this time. We both do. We can fight Trent without becoming what he is." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "After this is over, assuming we survive, I'd like to ask you something." "What?" "I'd like to ask if you'd consider—" He stopped, searching for words. "If you'd consider making this permanent. You and me. This life we've been building." Clara's heart swelled. "Jacob Holt, are you proposing to me?" "Not yet. Not while we're in danger, and you might only say yes, out of fear or obligation." He turned to look at her, his grey eyes serious. "But when this is done, when Trent's answered for what he's done, I'd like to ask proper. With a ring and everything." Clara kissed him then, gentle and sweet, a promise of what could be. "Then we better make sure we survive," she whispered. The day of the meeting arrived cold and grey. Clara dressed carefully, her best dress, her hair pinned up, Thomas's ring on her right hand, and Sarah's locket around her neck. Armor of a different kind. Jacob saddled both horses. He'd ride ahead, find a position near Trent's ranch where he could watch without being seen. Clara would arrive an hour later, giving Jacob time to get in place. Before she left, Doc Brennan came by with final instructions. "Judge Calloway arrives this afternoon. I've arranged for him to stay at my house. Told him I have urgent medical testimony about a suspicious death. Once you're safely back from Trent's ranch, we'll present everything. And if Trent doesn't let me leave," Clara asked, "then Jacob and I will come get you," Doc Brennan said firmly. "With half the town, if necessary." Clara smiled, touched by the older man's courage. "Thank you for finally standing up. Should have done it months ago." Doc Brennan squeezed her hand. Give them hell, Clara. The ride to Trent's ranch was the longest of Clara's life. Every mile brought her closer to the man who'd killed her husband, who'd terrorized her, who'd tried to destroy everything she had. But she wasn't the same frightened widow anymore. She was a woman with evidence, with allies, and with a mountain man who'd fight the devil himself to keep her safe. Trent's ranch appeared ahead, massive, ostentatious, built on stolen wealth and broken lives. Clara touched the locket at her throat, thinking of Sarah and Emma, thinking of Thomas, thinking of all the people Trent had hurt. This ended today. One way or another, this ended today. Clara was shown into Trent's study by a nervous ranch hand who wouldn't meet her eyes. The room was designed to intimidate. Massive oak desk, expensive paintings, a gun collection on the wall that probably cost more than most people in Cold Creek earned in a lifetime. Trent stood by the window, his back to her, examining his pocket watch. The silver gleamed in the afternoon light, and Clara noticed the engraving on the back, ST, ornate and self-important. "Mrs. Dawson," he said without turning, "I'm pleased you've come to your senses." "I'm here to discuss terms," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "Nothing more?" Trent turned, and his smile was all predator. "Of course, terms." He gestured to a chair. "Please sit." Clara remained standing. "I'd rather not." "Suit yourself." Trent moved to his desk, poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "I assume you understand your position by now. No friends, no resources, no options. The smart thing is to accept my generous offer, your offer to come work at your ranch. Among other things." His meaning was clear and disgusting. "You're an attractive woman, Clara, and I reward loyalty." Clara fought to keep her expression neutral. "What about the debt? The promissory note? Who would disappear? Along with the seizure order on your house in town." Trent sipped his whiskey. "I can be quite forgiving when people cooperate. And Jacob Holt?" At the mention of Jacob's name, something flickered in Trent's eyes. Something dark and satisfied. The hermit? "He'll need to leave the territory immediately." Trent set down his glass. "In fact, that's non-negotiable. Part of our arrangement is that you sever all contact with him." "Why? What do you care about a man living alone on a mountain?" "Because I know who he is," Trent said softly. "And I know what he did." Clara's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to show nothing. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Trent walked around his desk, closing the distance between them. 15 years ago, Jacob Holt murdered my business partner, shot him in cold blood, and left him to die in the mountains outside Helena. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Marcus Wolfe was my friend, my partner, and Holt killed him over a piece of worthless land. Trent's voice was venomous now. "I've been looking for him ever since. And then, like a gift from God, he appeared here. Stayed hidden for years, and I couldn't touch him without proof. Until you," Clara's mind raced. This confirmed what they'd suspected, but hearing Trent admit it so casually was chilling. "If you believe he murdered someone, why not go to the law?" Trent laughed. "The law? The law doesn't care about men like Marcus Wolfe. He was a businessman doing what needed to be done, and some self-righteous homesteader decided to play judge and executioner." He leaned closer. "But I care. I've waited 15 years for this moment, when I could make Jacob Holt watch everything he cares about being destroyed. The way he destroyed Marcus. The way he destroyed our partnership." Trent's eyes glittered with malice. "Your husband was just the beginning." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "What? Thomas Dawson? Curious man, wasn't he? Good with numbers, liked to research things." Trent picked up his pocket watch again, checking the time as if discussing murder was just another appointment. "He discovered the connection between me and Marcus, found records from Helena, started asking questions. Became a problem." Clara's hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. "You killed him. I arranged for an accident. Not my first, won't be my last." Trent said it so casually, so matter-of-factly that Clara wanted to scream. "Thomas was in the way, and his death served a larger purpose. It brought you into my orbit. A lonely widow, vulnerable, desperate. Perfect bait to draw out the hermit. You planned all of this, every move." Trent smiled, pleased with himself. The fake debt, the harassment, the social isolation, all carefully calculated to make you turn to the only person you had left. To make Jacob Holt step out of the shadows and show himself, he gestured around the room.
And here we are.
You played your role perfectly. Clara felt sick. Thomas's death, her suffering, the entire nightmare, all orchestrated by this monster for revenge. You won't get away with this, she said, her voice trembling with rage. I already have. Trent moved back to his desk, opened a drawer. Sheriff Markham works for me. Judge Calloway will rule however I tell him to. And as for your mountain man, well, let's just say I have plans for Jacob Holt that will make what happened to Marcus look merciful. He pulled out a stack of papers. Wanted posters. Legal documents. Clara's blood froze when she saw Jacob's face on the top poster. The reward was $5,000 for the murder of Marcus Wolfe. These go out tomorrow, Trent said. Every bounty hunter and lawman in 3 territories will be looking for him. He'll hang or he'll run. Either way, I win. Clara's mind was spinning. This was worse than they'd imagined. Trent had been playing a longer game, setting traps they hadn't even seen. Why tell me this? Clara asked. Why not just do whatever you're planning? Because I want you to understand your choice. Trent came close again, and Clara could smell the whiskey on his breath. You can stay here, accept my protection, and live comfortably while Jacob Holt faces justice. Or you can refuse, and I'll make sure you hang alongside him as an accomplice to murder. That's insane. I didn't even know Jacob 15 years ago. Doesn't matter. I own the law here. I can make the charges stick. His hand shot out, gripped her arm, the same possessive grab as in the trading post. You're mine, Clara. The only question is whether you accept it gracefully or whether I have to break you first. Clara looked at the hand on her arm, at Trent's arrogant face, at the wanted posters on his desk. Everything in her wanted to fight, to scream, to shoot him with the pistol hidden in her dress pocket. But she needed more. She needed him to confess everything, needed proof that would stand up even against his corruption. And then she realized Pastor Wells had given them more than just Thomas's letter. The pastor had given them the truth about Trent's attempts at bribery. Doc Brennan had compiled testimony from multiple victims. They had Thomas's ledger showing the torn pages. They had the pattern of deaths and accidents surrounding Trent's land acquisitions. What they needed now was Trent's own voice admitting to it all. Clara touched her left ear, the signal to Jacob that she was in danger. Then she said, Thomas wrote a letter before he died. Documented everything he knew about you and Marcus Wolfe. It's with the territorial marshal by now. It was a lie, but she needed to see Trent's reaction. His face went white, then red with rage. You're bluffing. Am I? Thomas gave it to Pastor Wells, with instructions to mail it if anything happened to him. The pastor kept it out of fear, but he finally sent it 3 days ago. Trent's hand tightened on her arm, painful now. You stupid woman. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've made sure you answer for your crimes. The marshal can't touch me. I have connections in Helena, friends in the territorial government. Do they know about the murder? About Marcus Wolfe's death and your part in covering it up? Clara pushed, needing him to say more. Do they know you've been running the same operation here that got Wolfe killed? Marcus wasn't killed for the operation, Trent snarled. He was killed because Jacob Holt couldn't accept that progress sometimes requires sacrifice. Those homesteaders were in the way of something bigger. We offered them fair prices. You burned their homes, killed their families. Casualties of business. Trent's mask of civility had completely dropped now. This territory was built on taking what we needed. The strong survive, the weak get swept aside. That's how it works. That's murder. That's survival. He shoved her away, began pacing. You think your letter matters? You think some territorial marshal gives a damn about a few dead homesteaders from 15 years ago? Or about Thomas Dawson, who should have minded his own business? Clara backed toward the door, her hand moving to her pocket where the pistol waited. You just confessed to everything. Who's going to believe you? A desperate widow making accusations against a respected businessman. Trent laughed, but there was an edge of panic in it now. You have nothing. She has me. The voice came from the doorway. Doc Brennan stood there, and beside him was a man Clara didn't recognize. Tall, weathered, with a silver badge on his chest. Territorial Marshal William Hayes, the stranger said, stepping into the room. "And I heard every word." Trent's face went from red to ashen. "How?" "Mrs. Dawson's letter arrived a week ago," Marshal Hayes said. "I've been investigating quietly, and Doc Brennan was kind enough to arrange this meeting. You see, we needed a confession. Something that would stand up even against your considerable influence." Clara felt dizzy with relief. The letter had been sent. Pastor Wells must have found a way. And the marshal had come, had actually come. "You can't, this is entrapment. This is justice," Marshal Hayes said firmly. He nodded to two deputies who appeared behind him. "Silas Trent, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, intimidation, and the murder of Thomas Dawson." Trent's hand moved toward the gun on his desk. "Don't," came Jacob's voice from the window. He was there, rifle aimed steady, his grey eyes cold as winter. "Give them any reason, Trent, please." For a long moment Trent stood frozen. Then his shoulders sagged, and the fight went out of him. The deputies moved in, taking his arms, binding them behind his back. As they led him past Clara, Trent hissed, "This isn't over. I've lawyers, connections. You have nothing," Clara said quietly, "except the rest of your life to think about the people you hurt." Marshal Hayes approached Clara gently. "Are you all right, ma'am?" "I am now." Clara looked to the window where Jacob stood, and their eyes met. Safe. They were safe. As the deputies took Trent away, the man reached for his pocket watch one last time, as if checking how much time he had left. The marshal caught his hand. "You won't need that where you're going." Silas Trent, who'd controlled time and fate for so many people for so long, was finally out of time himself. The aftermath moved quickly, like a dam breaking. Within hours, Cold Creek transformed from a town held silent by fear into one bursting with testimony and truth. Marshal Hayes set up a temporary office in Doc Brennan's front room, and people began arriving, tentatively at first, then in a steady stream. The widow whose son had died in a hunting accident, the shopkeeper bankrupted by sudden supply problems, the rancher forced to sell at a fraction of his land's value. Even some of Trent's own ranch hands, men who'd been ordered to intimidate and threaten, came forward with stories that turned Clara's stomach. Jacob stayed close to Clara through it all, a steady presence at her side. They'd returned to town together after Trent's arrest, and Clara had watched something shift in Jacob's posture as they rode. The wariness was still there. 15 years of isolation didn't disappear overnight, but there was something else now. Relief, maybe, or the beginning of peace. Sheriff Markham was among the first arrested. His cooperation with Trent documented in letters the marshal found during a search of Trent's ranch. The sheriff had been on Trent's payroll for years, had looked the other way during harassment, had falsified reports to cover suspicious deaths. "I was afraid," Markham said, when they led him away in chains. "He threatened my family. What was I supposed to do?" "Your job," Marshal Hayes replied coldly. "You were supposed to do your job." The revelations about Thomas's death were the hardest for Clara to hear. One of Trent's ranch hands, a young man barely 20, with guilt written all over his face, described how he'd been ordered to meet Thomas at the logging site on the day of the accident. "Mr. Trent told me to make sure Thomas was standing in a specific spot when the load was released," the young man said, his voice shaking. "Said it was important for the business. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what would happen. But you suspected," Marshal Hayes said. After I knew. But I was scared. Mr. Trent said if I talked, he'd make sure I hung for murder." Clara listened to this testimony with tears streaming down her face, Jacob's hand tight in hers. Thomas had been murdered for trying to stop a criminal, for doing the right thing. Pastor Wells provided his testimony about Thomas's letter and Trent's attempted bribery. Mrs. Yates spoke about the intimidation she'd witnessed. Even Judge Calloway, who'd arrived expecting to rule in Trent's favor, found his conscience when confronted with the weight of evidence. "I'm ashamed," the judge said to Clara privately. "I knew Trent was ruthless, but I told myself that was just business. I looked the other way because it was easier than standing up. Your husband was a better man than me. He would have appreciated you saying so, Clara replied, though the words felt hollow. Thomas was still dead, and no amount of justice would bring him back. On the third day after Trent's arrest, Marshal Hayes called Clara and Jacob to Doc Brennan's office for a private conversation. I need to discuss Jacob Holt's status, the marshal said, his expression serious. Clara felt Jacob tense beside her. What about it? There are wanted posters for Jacob Holt regarding the death of Marcus Wolfe 15 years ago. Marshal Hayes pulled out one of the posters, never issued. Thankfully, but prepared by Trent. I need to know what happened that night. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I killed him. Clara's hand tightened on his, but she said nothing. Tell me the circumstances, Marshal Hayes said. Jacob's voice was steady as he recounted the night his family died. The fire, Sarah and Emma's screams. The men who'd set it, who worked for Wolfe. His hunt for justice through every legal channel, all of which failed because Wolfe had money and influence. So you tracked him down, Marshal Hayes said. I tracked down the men who set the fire first, made them talk. They confessed that Wolfe had ordered it, that it was part of a pattern. Jacob's jaw was tight. I went to the authorities in Helena. They said there wasn't enough evidence. Wolfe had alibis, witnesses who'd been paid to lie. So you took matters into your own hands. I found Wolfe alone at his mining site, confronted him. He admitted everything, laughed about it, said my family was in the way of progress. Jacob's voice cracked slightly. I shot him, left him there and disappeared into the mountains. Been hiding ever since. Marshal Hayes was quiet, studying Jacob's face. Finally, he said, Wolfe's death was ruled an accident, fell down a mine shaft, according to the official report. Trent always suspected otherwise, but there was never enough evidence to pursue murder charges. I'm not asking for mercy, Jacob said. I killed a man. If there's a price to pay, there's already been a price, Marshal Hayes interrupted. 15 years of isolation, 15 years of guilt, and from what I've learned this week, Marcus Wolfe was responsible for at least a dozen deaths that were never investigated. Homesteaders, small ranchers, anyone who got in his way. That doesn't make what I did right. No, the marshal agreed, but it makes it complicated. And given the circumstances, a man driven to desperation after the law failed him. After his family was murdered, I think there's an argument for self-defense and extreme emotional distress. Clara spoke for the first time. What are you saying? I'm saying that Marcus Wolfe's death remains an accident in the official records. Silas Trent's accusations died with his arrest, and as far as the territorial government is concerned, Jacob Holt is a citizen who helped expose a major criminal operation. Marshal Hayes looked directly at Jacob. You're free. Mr. Holt, the past stays buried where it belongs. Jacob seemed unable to process this. I don't understand. I'm giving you a second chance, Marshal Hayes said. Don't waste it. After they left Doc Brennan's office, Clara and Jacob walked through Cold Creek in silence. The town looked different now. People met their eyes, nodded greetings. Mrs. Yates waved from the trading post window. Even some of the church ladies who'd shunned Clara offered tentative smiles. Fear's grip had broken, and the town was remembering how to be decent. They stopped at Thomas's grave in the small cemetery behind the church. Clara knelt, placed her hand on the headstone. It's over, Thomas, she whispered. The man who killed you is going to prison for the rest of his life. Your letter, the one you wrote, it saved me. It saved all of us. Jacob stood a respectful distance away, giving her privacy. After a few minutes, Clara stood and rejoined him. I think I'm ready now, she said. Ready for what? To say goodbye? To Thomas, to this old life. To let myself move forward. She took Jacob's hand. With you, if the offer's still open. Jacob's expression softened. It's open. Always will be. They walked back toward the cabin as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Tomorrow, Marshal Hayes would be leaving to transport Trent and the other arrested men to the territorial prison. There would be a trial eventually, but the outcome was certain. Too much evidence, too many witnesses, too much truth finally brought to light. That evening, sitting on the cabin porch with coffee and the comfortable silence they'd built between them, Jacob said, "I've been thinking about the future. What about it? The cabin's not big enough for two people long term. We could expand it, add a proper bedroom, maybe a larger kitchen." He glanced at her. "If you were planning to stay permanent, that is." Clara smiled. "I might be convinced. What else?" Doc Brennan mentioned that some of Trent's victims might need help rebuilding homes, livelihoods. "I thought maybe I could help with that. Use my hands for building instead of hiding. That sounds good." "What would I do?" "Whatever you want," Jacob said simply. "You're the strongest person I know, Clara. You could do anything." Clara thought about it. "I could help Mrs. Yates at the trading post. Or maybe start something new. A school, perhaps. Cold Creek doesn't have a proper schoolhouse." "A teacher and a builder," Jacob mused. "We'd make a good team. We already do." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, the same stars that had witnessed so much pain and struggle. But tonight they felt like promise instead of judgment. "Jacob," Clara said quietly. "Yeah? You said you'd ask me something proper when this was all over. When I could answer without fear or obligation." Jacob set down his coffee cup, turned to face her. In the lamplight from the cabin, his weathered face was gentle, hopeful. "Clara Dawson," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I came to these mountains 15 years ago thinking I'd die here alone. Thinking that was what I deserved after what I'd done. Then you showed up in a snowstorm with supplies and kindness, and you didn't even know you were saving my life." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You've made this cabin a home. Made me remember what it's like to care about someone, to want to build a future instead of just surviving day to day." Jacob reached into his pocket, pulled out a simple gold band. Not fancy, but honest. "I know I'm not an easy man. I know I've got darkness in my past that won't ever fully go away. But I promise you, I'll spend every day of the rest of my life being worthy of the second chance you've given me." He held out the ring. "Will you marry me?" Clara didn't hesitate. "Yes." Jacob slipped the ring onto her finger, her left hand where it belonged. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. They kissed as the mountains stood witness, ancient and eternal. Two broken people who'd found each other in the ruins and built something worth keeping. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a wedding to plan, a cabin to expand, a community to help rebuild. But tonight was for this moment, this promise, this beginning. The darkness that had haunted both of them for so long finally felt like it was lifting, replaced by something Clara had thought she'd never feel again. Hope. Pure, unburdened, honest hope. The trial began 3 weeks later in Helena. Clara and Jacob made the journey together, riding through early November snow, their horses steady beneath them. Marshal Hayes had requested their testimony, and Clara knew she needed to face Trent one final time, not as a victim, but as a witness to justice. The territorial courthouse was an imposing building, all stone and authority. Inside, the courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists from Eastern newspapers, and a gallery full of Trent's victims who'd traveled to see him answer for his crimes. Trent sat at the defendant's table in prison clothes, his expensive suits and polished boots gone. Without his trappings of wealth, he looked smaller somehow, diminished. But when his eyes met Clara's across the courtroom, she saw that the hatred was still there, burning cold and implacable. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. Thomas's letter, read aloud in Thomas's own words, documenting years of criminal activity. The testimony of ranch hands who'd carried out Trent's orders. Financial records showing the pattern of fraud. Doc Brennan's compiled testimony from multiple victims. When Clara was called to the stand, she walked forward with her head high, Jacob's ring solid on her finger. The prosecutor was a stern woman named Margaret Blackwood, who'd made a reputation prosecuting corruption cases. "Mrs. Dawson," she began, "please tell the court about your husband, Thomas Dawson." Clara spoke clearly, describing Thomas's character, his meticulous business practices, the impossibility that he would have borrowed money without documenting it. She described finding the torn pages in his ledger, the bruise on his temple that Doc Brennan had noted, the suspicious circumstances of the accident. And when did you first suspect Mr. Trent's involvement in your husband's death? When I found the promissory note was a forgery. Thomas would never have signed such a document, and the handwriting, while close, wasn't quite right. Trent's lawyer, an expensive man brought in from Denver, tried to discredit her during cross-examination. Mrs. Dawson, isn't it true that you were cohabitating with Jacob Holt mere months after your husband's death? I was staying at his cabin while helping him with repairs, Clara replied calmly. And my personal life has nothing to do with Mr. Trent's crimes. It speaks to your character. Your reliability as a witness. My character, Clara interrupted, her voice steel, is that I survived a powerful man's attempt to destroy me, that I stood up when everyone else was too afraid, that I sought justice for my murdered husband. If that damages my reliability, so be it. The courtroom murmured approval. Even the judge looked impressed. Jacob's testimony came next. He described his history with Marcus Wolfe, the night his family died, his hunt for justice through legal channels that all failed. His voice was steady, unflinching as he admitted to killing Wolfe. I'm not proud of what I did, he said, but I'd do it again to protect my family, just as I'd do it again to protect Clara from Trent. Mr. Holt, the prosecutor asked, did you know Thomas Dawson? No, ma'am, never met him. Did you have any involvement in the events leading to his death? None. I was living alone on my mountain, hadn't been to Cold Creek in months when Thomas died. So Mr. Trent's claim that you conspired with Mrs. Dawson is a lie, Jacob said flatly, like everything else he's said. The defense tried to paint Jacob as a dangerous vigilante, a murderer who'd seduced a vulnerable widow, but the jury could see what Clara saw. A man who'd been pushed beyond endurance, who'd spent 15 years paying for one moment of desperate justice, and who'd finally found redemption in protecting someone else. The most damning testimony came from Walter Price, the undertaker and Trent's brother-in-law. Facing charges of his own for evidence tampering, Price had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Mr. Trent told me to get Thomas Dawson's ledger, Price said, his voice shaking. Said there were pages that needed to disappear. I used my key to Clara's house, found the ledger, tore out the pages that showed Thomas had been paid in full for all his dealings with Trent. What did you do with those pages? Burned them. Mr. Trent watched to make sure. And the promissory note? Trent forged it. I saw him practicing Thomas's signature, getting it just right. Took him a dozen tries before he was satisfied. The courtroom erupted. The judge had to call for order. Trent's lawyer tried to salvage the case, but it was hopeless. Too much evidence, too many witnesses, too much truth finally dragged into the light. When Silas Trent took the stand in his own defense, he was arrogant and unrepentant. I'm a businessman, he declared. Everything I did was legal at the time. If some people got hurt along the way, that's the cost of progress. You murdered Thomas Dawson, the prosecutor said. I arranged an accident to protect my interests. That's not murder. That's self-preservation. The jury's faces showed their disgust. And Marcus Wolfe, your partner who burned families alive to steal their land? Marcus understood that this territory was built by strong men willing to do what was necessary, even if it meant killing children. Trent shrugged. Casualties happen. It's unfortunate, but he didn't get to finish. Jacob was on his feet, moving toward the defendant's table before anyone could react. Marshal Hayes and 2 deputies grabbed him, held him back, but the look on Jacob's face, pure, righteous fury, made Trent shrink in his chair. You don't get to call them casualties, Jacob said, his voice shaking with rage. They were people. Sarah was a person. Emma was a person. Thomas Dawson was a person. You don't get to dismiss them. Mr. Holt, sit down, the judge ordered, but her voice was gentle. Jacob allowed himself to be led back to his seat, but the moment had impact. The jury had seen a father's grief, a man's justified anger, and they'd seen Trent's complete lack of remorse. The trial lasted another 2 days, but the outcome was never in doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, stood and faced the judge. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder. How do you find? Guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree regarding Thomas Dawson? Guilty. On the charges of fraud, intimidation and corruption of public officials? Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in applause. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of relief, of vindication. Jacob's hand found hers, squeezed tight. Trent sat motionless at the defendant's table, his face blank. All the arrogance, all the confidence had drained away. He was just a man now, a criminal, facing consequences. The judge called for order, then addressed Trent directly. "Mr. Trent, you have been found guilty of some of the most heinous crimes to come before this court. You used your wealth and influence to terrorize an entire community, to corrupt the institutions meant to protect people, and to murder a good man who threatened to expose your crimes." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The law provides for capital punishment in cases of premeditated murder. The prosecution has requested the maximum penalty." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't considered that Trent might hang. Part of her, the part still raw with grief over Thomas, wanted that. But another part, the part that had learned mercy from Jacob's long years of guilt, hesitated. The judge continued, "However, taking into account your cooperation in identifying other criminal enterprises and the testimony of victims who have requested mercy on your behalf." Clara was surprised by this. She'd requested no such thing. But looking around, she saw some of the other victims nodding, people who'd lost more than she had, who somehow found it in themselves to choose life over death. "This court sentences you to life imprisonment at hard labor with no possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your days paying for your crimes, Mr. Trent, and you will do so knowing that the people you tried to destroy survived and prospered without you." Trent's composure finally broke. No, you can't. I have money, connections. You have nothing," the judge said firmly. "Your assets are being seized to compensate your victims. Your ranch, your accounts, everything you stole will be returned to those you harmed. Take him away." As the deputies led Trent from the courtroom, he looked back one final time. His eyes found Clara, and for just a moment she saw something that might have been regret. Or maybe just the desperate fear of a man finally facing justice. Clara felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a profound sense of completion. Thomas's death had been avenged. The monster had been caged. It was finally truly over. Outside the courthouse, they were surrounded by well-wishers and other victims who testified. Mrs. Yates had made the journey to Helena, as had Pastor Wells and several others from Cold Creek. Even Judge Calloway was there, having resigned his position in shame and looking to make amends. "Thank you," a woman said to Clara, the widow whose son had died in Trent's hunting accident. "Thank you for being brave when the rest of us couldn't be." "We were all brave," Clara replied. "We survived. That's its own kind of courage." Doc Brennan pulled Clara aside, his expression serious. "There's something you should know. During the asset seizure, they found something in Trent's safe. A letter." "What kind of letter?" "From Thomas to you." Doc Brennan handed her an envelope, sealed and addressed in Thomas's handwriting. Trent must have intercepted it somehow before Thomas's death, never delivered it. Clara took the letter with shaking hands. "Thank you." She and Jacob found a quiet spot in a small park near the courthouse. Snow was falling gently, coating the world in white. Clara sat on a bench and carefully opened the envelope. Thomas's handwriting filled the page, familiar, precise, achingly real. "My dearest Clara," it began, "if you're reading this, then my suspicions about Silas Trent have proven correct, and I am likely gone. I'm so sorry to leave you this way, but I could not stay silent about what I discovered. You deserved a better husband than me, someone who loved you with passion instead of comfortable affection. But I hope you know that I cared for you deeply, that our quiet life together brought me more happiness than I ever expected to find. Do not grieve for too long. You're still young, Clara, with so much life ahead of you. Find someone who makes your heart race, who sees your strength and your kindness. Build a life that's truly yours, not just the one we settled into. I've arranged for Pastor Wells to hold a letter for the territorial marshal documenting what I know about Trent. If something happens to me, make sure it gets sent. Get justice, Clara. Not for revenge, but so others won't suffer what we've suffered. Live well, love freely, don't let my death make you small. Always your friend, Thomas. Clara read the letter 3 times, tears falling onto the paper and smudging the ink. Thomas had known. He'd known he was in danger, had prepared for his death, and had spent his last thoughts trying to protect her and give her permission to move on. She handed the letter to Jacob, who read it silently. When he finished, he pulled Clara close. "He was a good man," Jacob said quietly. "He was. And he'd be happy for us, I think. Happy that I found you?" "Think so?" Clara nodded. "He always wanted me to be happy, even if he couldn't quite figure out how to make that happen himself." They sat together as the snow fell, mourning the good man who died trying to do the right thing and celebrating the future he'd wanted Clara to have. Finally, Clara folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket next to Sarah's locket. 2 pieces of the past carried forward. Not as burdens, but as reminders. "Ready to go home?" Jacob asked. Clara stood, brushed snow from her coat, and took his hand. "Yes, let's go home." 2 months later, on a clear January morning, Clara Dawson married Jacob Holt in the small church in Cold Creek. The ceremony was simple, no fancy decorations, no elaborate dress, just 2 people making promises in front of the community that had finally learned to stand together. Pastor Wells performed the ceremony, his voice strong and certain. Mrs. Yates stood as Clara's witness, Doc Brennan as Jacob's. The church was full, not just with people from Cold Creek, but with folks from neighboring towns who'd heard the story and wanted to see the ending for themselves. Clara wore a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers that Jacob had somehow found blooming in a sheltered valley despite the winter cold. She wore 2 rings on her right hand, Thomas's gold band and Sarah's locket on a chain around her wrist. The past honored, but not controlling the present. Jacob wore his father's suit, carefully preserved and altered to fit. His grey eyes were bright with emotion as Clara walked down the aisle, not given away by anyone because she belonged to herself and was choosing this freely. "Do you, Clara Elizabeth Dawson, take this man to be your husband?" Pastor Wells asked. "I do," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, Jacob William Holt, take this woman to be your wife?" "I do." Jacob's voice was rough with emotion, but the words were firm. They exchanged rings, Clara's simple gold band joining Jacob's on her left hand, a matching band going onto Jacob's finger, the first ring he'd worn since Sarah died. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Pastor Wells smiled. "Jacob, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, sweet, full of promise. The church erupted in applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, Clara saw faces full of joy, people who'd been afraid, who'd been silenced, who'd finally learned that standing together against evil was possible. This wedding was more than a marriage. It was a celebration of courage, of justice, of healing. The reception was held at the trading post, with Mrs. Yates providing food and drink. Someone had brought a fiddle, and soon there was music and dancing. Clara found herself passed from partner to partner. Doc Brennan, who waltzed surprisingly well, the young ranch hand who'd testified against Trent and was trying to build a new life. Even Judge Calloway, who'd stayed in Cold Creek to help establish a new, honest legal system. "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Holt," the judge said as they danced. "This town is lucky to have you." "We're lucky to have each other," Clara corrected. "That's what we learned, that we're stronger together." As the sun began to set, Clara and Jacob slipped away from the celebration. They rode up to the cabin, their cabin now officially. Over the past 2 months, they'd expanded it just as Jacob had planned. A larger bedroom with a real window, a proper kitchen with a new stove, shelves for Clara's books and Jacob's tools, yellow curtains in every window just as Clara had wanted. The place that had been a refuge for a broken man had become a home for two people building a future. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth. Clara had prepared everything earlier: fresh sheets on the bed, food in the pantry, lamps filled and ready. But neither of them was thinking about practical things. Jacob pulled Clara close, rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd have this again. A wife, a home, a future." "Neither did I," Clara whispered. "After Thomas died, I thought the best parts of my life were over. And now? Now I think they're just beginning." They made love slowly, tenderly. Two people who'd both known loss and were learning to trust joy again. Afterward, they lay tangled together, watching the firelight dance on the ceiling. "Tell me something," Clara said. "Something about the future." Jacob thought for a moment. "I want to build things. Real things. Homes for the people Trent displaced, a proper schoolhouse so you can teach. Maybe even a church, a new one, built by people who actually care about community, instead of just appearances." "That sounds good." "What else?" "I want to wake up next to you every morning. Watch you read by the fire. Listen to you laugh. Grow old with you in these mountains." He kissed her forehead. "Simple things. After years of just surviving, I want to actually live," Clara smiled. "I want that too. I want to teach children to read, help Mrs. Yates run the trading post, maybe write down our story so people remember what happened here. I want to honor Thomas and Sarah and Emma by living well, by being happy. They'd want that." "I know." They drifted to sleep as the fire burned low. Two people who'd found each other in the aftermath of tragedy and built something strong enough to weather whatever came next. The next morning, Clara woke to find Jacob already up, standing by the new window in their bedroom. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and pink. "Come look," he said softly. Clara joined him, wrapped in a blanket, and looked out at the view. The valley below, Cold Creek just visible in the distance, the mountains standing eternal around them. It was beautiful, harsh and unforgiving, but beautiful. "This is home now," Jacob said. "Really home, not just a place to hide, but a place to live." Clara leaned against him, feeling his warmth, his strength, his presence. "Yes, this is home." In town, people were waking up to a world where Silas Trent no longer controlled their lives. Sheriff Markham had been replaced by a deputy marshal who actually cared about justice. The assets seized from Trent were being distributed to his victims, helping them rebuild. And the story of how a widow and a mountain man had stood up to power and won, was spreading through the territory, giving courage to others facing their own battles. Change had come to Cold Creek, not through violence or revenge, but through people finding the strength to stand together and demand better. As Clara stood at the window with her husband, watching the sun rise on their first full day as a married couple, she thought about everything that had brought them here. The loss, the fear, the struggle, but also the courage, the community, the love that had grown in unexpected places. Sometimes the hardest thing in life is finding peace after loss. But Clara had learned something important. Peace wasn't something you found. It was something you built, one choice at a time, one day at a time, with the people brave enough to stand beside you. She'd built it. They'd built it together, and it was worth every moment of the fight. The mountains stood witness, ancient and eternal, as they had for countless stories before and would for countless stories to come. But this story, the tale of how a rough recluse and a grieving widow stood up to power and changed the balance of an entire frontier town, this story would be remembered. Not as a story of revenge, but as a story of justice. Not as a story of violence, but as a story of courage. Not as a story of loss, but as a story of love found in the most unlikely places. Clara Dawson Holt turned from the window, smiled at her husband, and began the rest of her life.